Good evening, viewers, and welcome to this edition of Resource PNG. Regulatory regimes are the laws and government regulations that govern the oil and gas industry within a country. In this episode, we find out more about the topic. Regulatory regimes are an extremely important element in the investment decision for transnational mining and petroleum companies in any country. Research indicates that of the top 20 criteria in assessing investment attractiveness, 90% have some connection with regulatory regimes. In tonight's presentation and interview, we speak with Lutz Heim, Managing Partner of Deloitte's PNG.
Welcome to the program.
Thank you. It's nice to be here.
So let's talk about regulatory regime. What is it, and what does it mean to Papua New Guinea?
A regulatory regime is the government environment for doing business in PNG. So it really is the entire environment of rules and regulations that apply to a project. Right. In this context, a resources project, when they come to operate in PNG.
All right. So what can influence the regulatory regime?
Generally speaking, it's all those matters that the government has control over in the long term and the short term. So it's things like the social, economic systems, the political systems, the level of corruption in the economy, the level of administrative efficiency and time, all of those things that you can think of that the government has an influence over when dealing with a new entrant and a business that's starting up in PNG.
So seeing that it involves all these factors, can it be changed in any way? Can you alter it in any way?
Absolutely. Every regulatory regime is moving in some direction or other. Some are quite stable, but they're clearly getting better and getting worse in a lot of cases. Some of the influences I referred to are long-term and therefore a little harder to shift. The level of corruption in the economy, for instance, can take time to deal with, to weed out. The level of infrastructure available for resource projects can take a long time to change if your economy doesn't have those infrastructures like railway lines and transport road networks. Other things can be taken care of more quickly. For instance, if a government is keen to attract investment, it can streamline its approval processes and make sure there's more of a one-stop shop approach rather than a linear approach to dealing with approvals. So the answer is there's a bit of both. You can do some things in the short term and make it easier, and you can work on the longer term issues as you go along. The pleasing thing about today's session by the Prime Minister is that he showed a willingness to attack the longer term harder issues as well as the registration and approvals type issues.
So you presented, in your presentation, you actually talked about how PNG fared with other countries within the region. There were two different surveys. One compared countries in Oceania and another one compared countries in Asia. How does PNG stand with these two surveys?
Generally speaking, it's probably in the 2/3 down the scale a little bit, and that's because it's perceived not to be quite as well organised in terms of its political system, its economic system. It's perceived to have a relatively high level of corruption, and it's perceived to be relatively slow in terms of its administration. One of the proxies I mentioned in the discussion was the time taken to register a business. Yeah. And I looked at some of the countries in Africa, and PNG takes specifically something like 3-4 times longer to register a new business than some of those other countries.
Right. Okay, so with those surveys that we presented, how did they come up with the results? How was the data analyzed? How was it collected?
What they do is they contact mining people, petroleum people in the different countries in which they operate. They give them a set of questions and they relate to the issues that they are looking to establish an opinion on. So in the case of the Fraser Institute survey, they queried for something like 18 different measures, and they compile those and they develop a policy potential index. So they combine them to come up with an overall measure of attractiveness for a regulatory regime. So it's basically a interview process, getting a lot of questions out there, understanding the feedback, and then dealing with them statistically to show where particular countries fit relative to each other.
So with the surveys that have come out, we know where Papua New Guinea stands compared to other countries in Asia and Oceania. How does that influence investment in our country? How will that attract more investors, or is it just going to shut the door on it?
It's not going to shut the door. We can see that as a simple matter of evidence. There's a huge interest in PNG right now. There's lots of companies looking for LNG resources in particular, gold. So clearly it hasn't been a disincentive to that effect. Nevertheless, the question probably comes up is, could we do better? Could we attract more interest if our perception was better, if our regulatory regime was seen as being more efficient? So it's not a disincentive to the extent that it's stopping people coming, but we could do better by the look of it.
So another thing you talked about was resource nationalism. What exactly is that?
Resource nationalism is a term that's been coined in the last several years, and it basically refers to the determination of governments to get a larger share of the benefits from their resource projects. That can be in terms of tax dollars to increase the amount of revenue. It can be through other benefits. It can be, for instance, that resource projects are requested, compelled, encouraged to add value in other parts of the chain, like they might do downstream processing. They might improve the human resources through training colleges and training programs. It's called beneficiation, and it's a matter of providing other value and not necessarily through the tax system. Also, one evidence we see of resource nationalism is by governments looking for an equity share in projects. So they actually get a share of the profits through an ownership position. The PNG government has taken an equity position in many projects over the years. It reserves the right to do that. The levels at which it does that are different for mining, petroleum and gas, but the right is there in all cases. And so clearly that's not a development that's new for this country. We have all of the revenue measures, all of the resource nationalism measures that other countries are looking at employing. We have them all in PNG already. The question that will arise when the government reviews its revenue package next year is whether they're happy with the outcome in terms of revenue or whether they think it can be improved. But certainly I don't see too many measures that haven't been used to this point.
Stay with us. We'll have more of the interview right after this break. In this segment, we speak to Lutz about the taxes paid by the extractive industries.
So let's talk about taxes. In the extractive industry, they have to pay a certain amount of tax. Now, for PNG tax regime, how much do they actually contribute in terms of gas, mine, and oil?
The tax rates in those industries are different. In terms of gas, it's a 30% income tax rate. Yep. In terms of petroleum, it has been a 50% rate. New discoveries in existing areas will be taxed at 45% income tax going forward, and mining is generally taxed at 30%. The oil and gas industries don't suffer a further tax on distribution of profits, so those tax rates are finished, complete. In the mining industry, you suffer a 10% withholding tax on dividends going out to shareholders. So effectively the rate of tax in mining is 40%. Those tax rates have been subject to design over the years, and they are specifically calculated and been worked out with respect to those particular industries to suit them.
So the Prime Minister, Honourable Peter O'Neill, had made some announcements recently concerning the extractive industry. How do you think that's going to influence change in it over the next coming years?
It's hard to say because all that he has announced so far is a review. So next year what we'll see is a review by the government assisted by the IMF as to how the PNG tax revenue package fits. It may be that they decide to make no changes at all. It may be that they consider bringing some increased tax rates. Until we know the outcome of the review, I don't think people will get too worried about it. In addition to that, there's also the issue of who any tax rate increases might apply to. There's an expression in this area called grandfathering, and what it essentially means is that you change the tax rates, but you only apply that to new ventures, and the existing ventures get taxed at the old rate. PNG has got a good record of being consistent with its tax administration and not changing the tax rates on existing ventures. So it may be that even if they do change the revenue package, they only apply it to new ventures. So until we see these things shake out, it's a little hard for people to react, and I think most people will just sit back and wait for now and see what the outcome is.
So the revision of laws, now say if there was a revision of law with the taxes, as you said, I know that it hasn't been changed yet and they're saying they're just revising it. Should PNG be open to such changes? Should we start looking at changing some of the laws just to make it a lot more beneficial for investors?
Well, I would say at the moment there's no great encouragement to do that because we've got plenty of investors coming in. There's plenty of interest in the country. In terms of changing the laws around taxes, that's already covered in the process of the review that we just discussed. I would suspect that we would gain a lot by simply executing some of our environmental and government licensing more quickly. I don't know what the changes in laws will achieve, but I think it's the government's right, and properly they should consider legislation that applies to this industries from time to time, because things do get out of date and you should review these matters. And so I don't see any reason to panic at this stage about the review of the tax position of these companies. I think it's a reasonable thing for the government to do and something that they should do from time to time. It doesn't necessarily speak to the fact that there'll be an increase. And even if there is, it may be that new venturers consider that not unreasonable in the circumstances.
Thank you, Mr. Lutzheim, for your time and enlightening us on the tax regime.
I hope I did. Thank you very much for having me.
After the break, we showcase an interesting presentation on regulatory regimes. Regulatory regimes have two main focuses. The first is an aspect of control, and the second is an enabling function. We'll discuss more with Lutzheim.
A little bit of introduction about regulatory regimes. There is a paucity of data and recent research in that area, so as a proxy for some conclusions, we had a look at some of the respected surveys that are in this area. And just to see what the state of play is around the world. I was conscious of not drowning you in tables and graphs, so I'll try and keep that relatively short. Having done that, I'd like to move on to where we see trends, and that can probably be encapsulated in the expression resource nationalism, which I'll also explain. And lastly, I'd like to do a little bit of a very brief comparison of PNG's regime with some of those regimes around the world. And in doing so, we'll just do a quick run through of the fiscal and regulatory regime in PNG, and then some closing comments. Regulatory regimes, it's not often recalled, but they have two main focuses. The first is the one that people tend to think of first, and that is an aspect of control. Licensing resource regimes, making sure that they function according to law, that they address all the issues that are indicated by government. Regulatory regimes also have another function, and that's an enabling function. It's important for resource ventures when they enter into a country to be afforded an environment where they can get their work done, they can get their necessary approvals, and be ensured that they'll be able to operate legally and without too much interruption. So there's an enabling component of regulatory regimes as well. It's well known, I think all of us here accept that the regulatory regime offered by a country is an extremely important element in the investment decision for transnational mining and petroleum companies. Research indicates that of the top 20 criteria in assessing investment attractiveness, 90% of them have some connection with the regulatory regime offered by the government. So A regulatory regime, I'm going to have trouble with that expression, is as much about how it's applied, how it's administered, as it is about the law behind it. We'll go on and discuss that, but you can see some of the issues and factors that are involved in how a regime is applied. Regulatory overlap, for instance. Some countries will give you issues whereby you have trouble with more than one department operating on the same issue, perhaps environmental or whatever. You need to have effective and efficient compliance systems, and that's not just about making sure that the resource company operates according to its charter. It's making sure that interruptions and other criminal acts against it are dealt with according to law and efficiently. Those things are an important place, and certainly PNG has made every effort across the years to try and provide that background. We need impartiality, independence of decision making. PNG has always been very good about providing access to regulators and information where it's possible. Certainly on the tax front, the government has been very open to meeting with operators directly and discussing the tax provisions in the past.
Coming up, Lutz gives us survey results on mining regulatory regimes. Thanks for staying with us on Resource PNG. The assessment of a regime can be a subjective process, and so Lutz takes us through a survey of mining regulatory regimes conducted by the Fraser Institute and its views on commodity price movements, corruption and policy potential.
The assessment of a regime can be a subjective process, and so that's another reason that I looked to some surveys. The first one that I went to is the annual survey produced by the Fraser Institute in Canada. It has three major strengths. It's extremely comprehensive. It's got something like 802 responses over 93 countries for 2012. The annual tracking is good, so you can see the way things develop over time, and obviously over a number of years it produces a cumulative body of data. With any survey, of course, you've got some biases, and that's acknowledged. For example, if an entity or business in a country subject to survey is successful, then you're likely to get a more positive feedback than you are if that business is having difficulties. The headline statistic under the Fraser Institute survey is an index called the Policy Potential Index. It is surveyed subject to 18 separate criteria over many, many questions, so it's really quite a detailed analysis. There are a number of other items surveyed. Corruption was a new addition this year, but there are also some comments about commodity price movements and policy potential in the countries being surveyed, and I'll refer to those in a minute. The Policy Potential Index looks at a number of different matters. I won't go through each one of those. One little point I wanted to make here is that you can see some of those items are probably longer term. Some of them can be addressed in the short term. You've got things like uncertainty concerning administration and duplication. Those things can really be attacked reasonably quickly and produce improvements in perception. Other matters like socio-economic issues and infrastructure obviously take longer. So to the extent that it's possible, governments really can work on their ratings in this area and improve their scores, if you like, and their perception amongst the investment community. Try as I might, I do have to show you some tables. I think the research I went to, I trust you can all read these numbers. I'm not going to analyse them in depth, but we see Oceania up the top there. The set of columns on the left-hand side is the score. You've got a maximum score of 100 if a country was to rank number one in everything. Obviously, no country's going to do that, but you can see some tendencies already there. On the right-hand side are the ranks by years. And so it's interesting to have a look and see which countries are doing well and which countries aren't in the Premiership table. You've got the developed countries tend to rate higher because their infrastructure is better and because their regulations are more settled. So New Zealand ranks relatively highly, and countries where, and South Africa for example, and countries where things are not so well developed tend to rate not so high. PNG's rating in this scale, and I'll return to this in a moment, is 66 out of 93, and that's largely reflective of the fact that it's relatively undeveloped. The survey also went through a couple of other indexes, and one of the things it looked at and tried to develop a number around was to see what the index would be if we looked at mineral potential under current regulation and whether it discourages or encourages investment. If you look at mineral potential and look at the survey results, then PNG moves from 66 out of 93 to 16 out of 93. So obviously there's a fairly bullish view about PNG's future as far as that goes. Respondents were also asked to comment on what would their rating be if the PNG regulatory regime was best practice and as good as it possibly could be. And PNG's rating went to 3 out of 93. So clearly the respondents believe there's a lot of potential in the PNG mineral space. The second page looks at some South American countries, and you could look at these numbers quite a lot, but once again you're struck by the wide variation. You've got Chile, which ranks very highly in world rankings, sitting at number 18. And next door in the same continent, you've got Bolivia and Venezuela sitting at 90 and 91 out of 93. So clearly there's a lot of variation possible depending on how you run your operation from a country perspective. The Fraser Institute also runs a survey of petroleum regulatory regimes, and also many respondents off 93 countries. They have a slightly different index for attractiveness, and they call it an all-inclusive composite index. I'm sorry, it's not actually 93 countries, it's 147. There's a number of sub-indexes under that survey too, and it really is an interesting look. What this graph attempts to show is the strength of the disincentives in the regulatory regimes in those particular countries. So in this case, a lower score is better than a higher score. And you can see Japan has a score in the lower under 30, and Uzbekistan is up around 85. The colour bars also indicate the strength of the deterrent. So you've got the green, which shows that the regulatory regime provides a mild deterrent to investment. The brown is a strong deterrent to investment, and the black is basically, well, we wouldn't pursue investment in this country. You can see a number of, what you'd call interesting things here. You look at Myanmar, which is about halfway down, and there are more responses indicating that they just wouldn't invest in that country than any other, even though it's not top of the rating overall. Generally speaking, there is a correlation between the width of the bars and the width of the response overall, but it's just interesting to see where different countries fall on that scale. If we look at Africa, we have similar outcomes. The Democratic Republic of the Congo, about 3/4 of the way down, has a very large wouldn't want to invest there component, but once again, it's not the highest ranking in terms of overall unattractiveness of investment. You've got Tunisia, Libya, Nigeria, countries relatively close to each other, which obviously run completely differently and produce different outcomes for the respondents. Closer to home, Oceania. Once again, the settled jurisdictions, the first world jurisdictions, obviously have better infrastructure, longer established rules, so they tend to score better in these results. You look at the less developed countries that are still working on it, and it's natural to understand they're going to rate a little bit higher. Once again, you get some interesting variations. There are quite a number of more responses indicating that people wouldn't invest in Timor-Leste as opposed to PNG, even though the score is slightly lower. Not being satisfied with just one survey, I thought I'd have a look at another one, and there's a advisory company called Bear Dolbear. It's not quite as open in terms of how the survey is done, what sort of questions are available, but it's a multinational firm. It operates in 55 countries, so it's interesting to have a look. These are the issues that survey looks at, and they all make sense and they're consistent with the work done by the Fraser Institute. If we look at what Bear Dolbear came up with, and I apologise again, this table may be a little bit hard to read, but they produce a Premiership table of 25 countries, and you can see those 7 factors that I mentioned on the previous slide strung across the top of the table. As you'd expect, Australia and Canada towards the bottom, and poor old Congo's down the bottom, and we've got a number of countries stretched in between. If we look at the PNG result, relatively high score for tax regime in its number, relatively high scores for currency stability and the economic and the political system. Obviously, where we've got big room for improvement is in permit delays. And this harks back to my point early on where I say that a regulatory regime is not just about the laws, it's about how they're enforced, and in particular, obviously, timeliness matters. So we could introduce some improvements in perception straight away by hopefully streamlining approval processes, for example.
We'll be back with more of Resource PNG after this break. Resource nationalism is the tendency of people and governments to assert control over natural resources over their territory. In this segment, Lutz gives us different approaches to resource nationalism.
The next thing that I'd like to look at is the state of play going forward. You know, what's going to happen in regulatory regimes. And as I said, it's around a concept of resource nationalism, and countries are having a much closer look at their share of the wealth generated by mining and oil and gas projects, and that's absolutely understandable. Some of that has been driven in recent times by high commodity prices, and we know that some of those prices are falling back a little bit. Obviously, gold is still strong, but you know, that's the reason it probably occurred. When people think of resource nationalism, they tend to think in terms of tax, because that's the government revenue take straight away. The issues under resource nationalism tend to centre around royalties, super profits taxes, and tax stability agreement negotiations. So looking at how those stability agreements are drafted, whether they can be tweaked. PNG has a revenue model which incorporates all of those 3 things. It has, as we'll see shortly, royalties. It has a super profits tax, and that's come in and out in various guises over the years. And they do have fiscal stability arrangements. So none of these techniques that are being looked at by other countries are new to Papua New Guinea. There are a number of approaches to resource nationalism. You can have the out and out, we'll take the project off you through military intervention. You can have expropriation of resources, and that has happened in some countries. You can use licensing as a tool to regulate and control investment. As we'll see in a slide a little later on, for example, even the developed countries resort to that. We saw in the US a few years ago a takeover of an oil company by CNOOC prevented. Generally, though, we usually look at use of the tax system and royalties to take a bigger share of the profits of the extraction and sale. There is equity participation. We'll look at that in a couple of minutes as well. Once again, I'll just add that, you know, that's part of the PNG regime, regulatory regime already. And then there's the concept of beneficiation, which is trying to produce beneficial results through the value chain as a result of those projects. That quite often comes down to downstream projects of some nature, and PNG has long had a keenness and interest to promote downstream projects in many of its industries, timber for instance. So this is not a new concept to us. And also promotion of PNG jobs and skill sets is another thing that people look to as a way of improving themselves. If we look around the world at some of the changes in resource nationalism recently, Deloitte kindly provided these slides from a mergers and acquisitions conference we did a few months ago, so they're probably 5 or 6 months out of date, but you can see some of the countries around the world where licensing has been used to further the interests of national governments, including revocation of licences or the non-granting of licences to entities where they weren't wanted. If we look at equity, participation and beneficiation, that seems to have been centred in Africa, and a number of countries have introduced measures by which the government can take a greater share or a share in resource projects. In some cases, you get a requirement that there be devolution of ownership after a few years onto a stock exchange, but generally that's about introducing a government share in those resource ventures. And as I said, PNG already has those rules and has had for quite some time. If we look at what's happening on the tax front, that's probably more interesting, and we can see that even in developed countries there's been re-examination of tax regimes around the world with a view to fine-tuning. The probably most spectacular example close to home is the mineral resources rent tax debate and introduction in Australia and how that was all carried around. We've seen some similar sort of moves in UK and Russia. In Africa and South America, it goes back to generally royalties and a windfall tax. A windfall tax is generally a tax that comes in at specified profit levels and imposes a rate of tax in what's considered to be super profits. Not all of those proposals got up. From what I can understand, in South Africa, which had a proposal for 50% windfall tax that, as late as I can find it, back in October this year, seems to have been discounted by the government there. So that one didn't go ahead in the end. But that's sort of the scheme around the world, what's happening in this area. If we look at the features of the PNG regulatory regime, as I said, you see elements of everything that we've discussed there. So there's been some considerable design thinking over the years in that regime. We've got, on the licensing front, exploration licences. There was a concept of retention licences introduced a few years ago. Some of the countries in Africa have a concept of reconnaissance licences, which is a more loose arrangement and just gives you some years to look around. I think that probably isn't appropriate in the PNG context, simply because it's hotter property. You may as well get them to licence and sign up to an agreed work program. We have the state reserving rights for equity acquisition at cost in different industries, and you can see the percentages there. So that's a riskless entry for the government. We've got environmental approvals and all the things you'd expect, and as I said, a competitive fiscal regime. The mining regime is generally a 30% tax rate for residents and a dividend withholding tax of 10%. That's equalised if you come in as a non-resident. The rate is 40% with no further tax on transmission of profits. You've got some of the features that you would expect in a regime, amortisation of your development expenditure. Some places in Africa have more beneficial rules. They allow 100% up front, sometimes 80%. Those rules tend to be being wound back at the moment and to more like a PNG regime where you've got some amortisation. In petroleum, you've got what looks like a very similar basic regime. In fact, the tax law shares a number of fundamental provisions and then goes into separate discussion about each type of venture. So in petroleum, you've got 50% for old oil and 45% tax rate for new oil. You've got frontier tax rates for incentive areas at 30%. There's nil dividend withholding tax and some of the other tax rules, and for instance GST. So that is the PNG tax regime in a nutshell.
After the break, we take a look at some competitor country examples. Welcome back. If you've just tuned in, we're viewing a presentation by Lutzheim on regulatory regimes around the world. We have so far covered survey results of other resource regulatory regimes, resource nationalism and different approaches to it, and the PNG regulatory regime. In this segment, we take a look at some other regimes and how they compare to PNG.
We just have a look at some other regimes and just to see how they compare, particularly when we hark back to that map and we think about where countries are looking to change their tax situations. And the logical place to look at is Africa, and quite a number of different changes occurring in Africa. And I just thought I'd put up that map quickly, which shows more about prospectivity than about regimes. And you can see those coloured areas are basically the hot area in Africa. And so we selected some of those countries, and I thought I'd just have a quick look at them. Up there on the table is Ghana, Tanzania, Zambia, Mozambique and South Africa. And Ghana is Africa's second largest producer of gold, probably one of the latest to change its taxes. Tanzania has gold and nickel in abundant quantities and is looking to grow rapidly in those areas. Zambia is South Africa's or Africa's largest copper producer with declining output in the last few years, and it's made a considerable effort in the recent past to elevate its position again through a combination of lower taxes, privatisation and just taking advantage of the increased price. Mozambique is also looking to grow. The market value of their mining interests is put around about US 96 million in 2010, and it's expected to grow to 667 in 2015. Lastly, South Africa is the largest economy in the traditional gold mining province in sub-Saharan Africa, so I thought it'd be interesting to have a look. Across the page we have populations to give us some idea of the size of those countries. The gross national income per capita in 2011. So South Africa obviously on average is a little more prosperous, but those figures range, but they're really indicative that these are developing economies. As a different proxy to regulatory regimes and how easy they are to navigate, I thought I'd just put in the World Bank Index number there, the ease of doing business, and we can see some varying results there. Mozambique really down the bottom. South Africa, as you'd expect, quite well up in the survey of 183 countries, and PNG about midway. The number in brackets behind those numbers I thought would be interesting to have a look at too. It's also a World Bank Index. It is the average number of days that it takes to set up a business in PNG or those countries listed. So this is one place where PNG comes off not so well, and maybe an area of improvement if we can cut down the regulatory time that's required to register. You look at the tax rates and the royalty rates. I should explain in the PNG column the mining rates, which are probably comparable with the other columns, are on the right-hand side, and on the left-hand side are the oil rates. The government was quite careful in its budget papers to say that we're not drawing any conclusions yet. We'll wait for the review, and we may not even necessarily adopt the findings of that review. So they're being very measured about the response, and you have to say that it's not an unreasonable thing to do, particularly in the context of developments around the world, to have a look at what the tax regime is doing. The only conclusion I draw here, I think, is that we don't seem to be out of the ballpark in PNG. You know, the rates look reasonably comparable, and obviously you have to go down in detail sometime in the future to have a look, but there don't appear to be any gross uncompetitiveness or gross generosity in those tax rates. What do we know about regulatory regimes around the world? We know that they're assessed continuously on a wide variety of factors. We know that they're assessed on how they're actually applied and not the law that underlies them. And timing is one of those things, and transparency is one of those things. And we can see from the way the PNG rating danced upwards when you took the regulatory regimes in conjunction with prospectivity, how that the ratings improved depending on how good the prospectivity is. Taxation considerations obviously form an important part of any regulatory regime. PNG has had a long and consistent history of not changing the rules. The only time I can remember in modern times that the revenue regime was moved upwards was in the case of Bougainville Copper many years ago, and it's a situation I looked at when I first came to PNG in the mid-80s. Bougainville Copper was originally a marginal mine. It was developed and allowed a 20% tax rate, and about the time that it came online, the gold price was deregulated and the revenue was staggering in terms of what was expected during development. The mine paid off its costs and earned a rate of 23% return on investment in under 3 years. So in those sort of conditions, you would expect any government to have a look at the tax package that applies, and PNG did, and I think it was quite reasonable to do that. When the review, which has been announced, gets conducted, obviously taxpayers and clients will be keenly interested on whether they're grandfathered or not. So will those rule changes apply to existing ventures, or will they just apply to new ones? In the past, PNG has been, as I said, pretty consistent about leaving original agreements in place, original rates in place, but we'll see what happens. There is one project in PNG that's got a tax exemption, so I mean that for 10 years, so it'll be interesting to see what happens with regard to that if there is in fact no grandfathering. That's more or less my discussion for today. One of the things I like to do when I'm looking at any piece of work or any report is, after I've had a look at what's there, is take a look at what's not there. You know, what's missing, what haven't we covered? And really, when you look at all those numbers and look at the way that regimes are administered around the world, the thing that stands out to me is that all of those regimes involve government ownership of resources.
That's all we have for tonight on Resource PNG. If you want to know more about the program, do email us on this address, resourcepng@mtv.com.pg, or check MTV online, that's www.mtv.com.pg, and go to our Resource PNG page. Until the same time next week, have a pleasant evening.